It was June 27, 1981. Inside a mosque in Tehran, a cleric stood before hundreds of people, ready to speak. A man walked up to him, dressed like a journalist, carrying a tape recorder. He placed it right in front of the cleric, smiled, and stepped back. Nothing unusual, just another reporter doing his job. Then came a strange whistling sound. A second later, the room exploded. The cleric survived, but his right hand was nearly destroyed, and his voice was damaged forever. Most people, after something like that, would walk away from public life. This man did the opposite. He went on to rule a country of 90 million people for nearly 40 years, built one of the most powerful networks of armed groups in the Middle East, and turned Iran into a force that both the United States and Israel feared enough to bomb directly. His name is Ali Khamenei, the second supreme leader of Iran. So who exactly is this man? How did a quiet cleric from a small city climb all the way to the top? And why, after 4 decades in power, did everything he built begin to fall apart? That is what we are going to find out today. To understand why that man never broke, not after the bomb, not after the years in prison, not after everything that came later, you have to go back to where it all started, back to 1939, in a small one-room house in the city of Mashhad, in the northeastern corner of Iran. Ali Khamenei was born on July 17, 1939, though some records say it was actually April 19th of the same year. No one has ever fully settled the disagreement. It is a small detail, but it fits the man perfectly. Even his birthday carries a question mark. The family was poor, genuinely poor. His father, Javad Khamenei, was a religious cleric who had studied in Najaf, a holy city in Iraq, before moving to Mashhad to build his life there. Javad was of Azeri background, an ethnic group from the northwest of Iran, and the family took its name from the small village of Khamenei where his ancestors had lived. As a respected cleric, Javad was looked up to in the community. People came to him for guidance, local leaders consulted him, and he led Friday prayers at the mosque. But respect does not fill a kitchen. The family lived in a single room, eating mostly bread, dates, and raisins. Khamenei himself later described this childhood many times, almost with a kind of pride, as if the hardship was something that shaped him rather than something that hurt him. His mother rarely gets mentioned in most stories about Khamenei, which is a shame because she seems to have been just as important as his father. She was educated, which was not common for women in Iran at that time, and she made sure her son grew up reading about Persian history, poetry, and art. If his father gave him discipline and faith, his mother gave him curiosity. That combination, quiet determination on one side and a love of ideas on the other, would follow Ali Khamenei for the rest of his life. He had 7 siblings in total. Most of them ended up in public life in one way or another, but the most surprising story belongs to his younger brother, Hadi. Hadi became a cleric and eventually a member of the Iranian parliament. He joined a group that was pushing for reform inside the country, including the idea that the supreme leader, the most powerful person in Iran, should have less power. In other words, Hadi was publicly arguing that his own brother had too much control over the country. It is the kind of family disagreement that most people settle over dinner. In Iran, it played out in newspapers and parliament halls. Then there is Khamenei's wife, Mansoureh. She married Ali in 1964 and gave him 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. But beyond that, almost nothing is known about her. There are no photographs of her available to the public. Most Iranians could not tell you what she looks like. In the one interview she ever gave, she described how she and her husband had discussed the risk of his arrest from the very first days of their marriage and how she had accepted that role, keeping the household together while he was in prison. She chose invisibility. Whether that was her decision or something expected of her, no one outside the family really knows. Even after Khamenei became the most powerful man in Iran, the family kept its modest way of living. No grand displays of wealth, no lavish lifestyle visible to the outside world. Whether that simplicity was genuine or carefully performed for public image is a question worth keeping in mind as we follow the rest of his story.
To understand Khamenei, you first have to understand the country that made him. Not just the geography, not just the religion, but the deep sense of identity that every Iranian child grows up with. Because Iran is not an ordinary country, and it has never seen itself that way. Most people know that during the 1800s, European powers carved up much of the world into colonies. Britain took India, Africa, Southeast Asia. France took North Africa and parts of Asia. The story repeated itself across dozens of countries. But Iran, then known as Persia, was never fully conquered. It bent under foreign pressure many times. It lost territory. It was pushed around by Russia from the north and Britain from the south. But it was never formally made into a colony. For Iranians, that fact matters deeply. It is a source of pride that has lasted for generations, a quiet voice in the back of every Iranian's mind that says, "We are different. We have always survived. We bow to no one." That pride is tied to a very long history. For centuries, Persia was one of the great powers of the region. Its empires stretched across Central Asia. Its culture, its poetry, its science influenced the entire world. Even when foreign armies swept through, Persian civilization found a way to absorb them and keep going. This is the history that Khamenei's mother taught him as a boy in that one-room house in Mashhad. By the time Khamenei was born in 1939, Iran had already gone through several major changes in leadership. For about a century before that, the country was ruled by the Qajar dynasty, a royal family that followed a branch of Islam called Twelver Shia. This form of Islam believes that after the Prophet Muhammad died, leadership of the faith passed through a line of 12 holy figures called imams. The last of these imams, according to this belief, did not die but went into hiding and will one day return to bring justice to the world. This idea of a hidden leader who will one day come back would later become deeply connected to the way Iran's government shaped itself after the revolution. The Qajar rulers were replaced in 1925 by a military officer named Reza Shah Pahlavi, who took power through a coup and pushed Iran in a very different direction. He wanted to modernize the country, to make it look and act more like the countries of Europe. Religious traditions were pushed aside. Western clothing, Western laws, Western ideas were brought in. Then, in 1941, during the Second World War, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran, worried it might side with Nazi Germany. Reza Shah was forced out, and his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed on the throne instead. The young Shah eventually grew into his power and ruled Iran for nearly 4 decades. On one hand, he built roads, schools, and hospitals. He gave women the right to vote and tried to reduce the influence of the clergy in daily life. On the other hand, he ran one of the most feared secret police forces in the world, called Savak. This organization watched, arrested, tortured, and sometimes killed anyone it considered a threat to the Shah's rule. There was no real freedom of speech. No real opposition was allowed. This was the Iran that shaped Ali Khamenei, a country proud of its ancient roots, yet controlled by a king who wanted it to look like Europe, a deeply religious society being pushed to set its religion aside, a nation where speaking the wrong words could land you in a prison cell. That tension between what Iran had always been and what the Shah wanted it to become would eventually explode. Khamenei would be standing right in the middle of it.
Growing up in that kind of environment, where religion was being pushed out of public life and the secret police could knock on your door at any moment, a lot of young men kept their heads down. They found safe jobs, stayed quiet, and tried not to draw attention. Khamenei went the other way. While still a teenager, he began walking the path of a religious scholar, a path that would eventually lead him to the most powerful seat in Iran. His education started in Mashhad, the city where he was born. Mashhad was not just any city. It was one of the holiest places in the world for Shia Muslims because it was the burial place of the 8th Imam, a deeply respected religious figure named Ali ibn Musa. The city was full of mosques, religious schools, and scholars who had spent their entire lives studying Islamic law and history. For a young man with a cleric father and a curious mind, it was the right place to begin. He studied under senior scholars in Mashhad for several years before crossing the border into Iraq to spend time in Najaf. Najaf is to Shia Muslims what the Vatican is to Catholics. It is the city where the first Imam, Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, is buried. Scholars from across the Islamic world traveled there to study and teach. Khamenei went, absorbed what he could, then returned to Iran and made his way to the city of Qom. Qom was and still is the heart of religious learning in Iran. It was there, in 1957, that Khamenei met the man who would change everything. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini, and at the time he was already known as a bold and outspoken critic of the Shah's government. Most clerics chose their words carefully when it came to politics. Khomeini did not. He said plainly what he believed, that the Shah was leading Iran in the wrong direction, that foreign powers were too deeply involved in the country's affairs, that Islam should not be pushed aside for the sake of looking modern. For a young student like Khamenei, already raised in a household of faith and already living under a government he distrusted, Khomeini's words must have felt like someone finally saying out loud what everyone else was only thinking. Khamenei studied under Khomeini and became one of his dedicated students. The teacher-student bond they built during those years would shape the next 4 decades of Iranian history. Then came 1963, and everything shifted. The Shah launched a sweeping set of changes he called the White Revolution, a plan to modernize Iran that included breaking up large landholdings owned by religious institutions and giving women the right to vote, among other reforms. To many Iranians, especially the clergy, this felt like a direct attack on their way of life and their influence over society. Khomeini became louder than ever in his opposition. He was arrested, which triggered protests across the country that left hundreds of people dead. Eventually, the Shah decided the easiest solution was simply to remove Khomeini from the country entirely. In 1964, Khomeini was sent into exile, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, where he would remain for over a decade. Many of Khomeini's followers went with him or joined him abroad. Khamenei did not. His father had gone nearly blind, and Ali chose to leave Qom and return to Mashhad to care for him. It was a personal decision rooted in family duty, but it had consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. By leaving before completing the full course of religious training, Khamenei never earned the highest level of religious qualification that the position of supreme leader was supposed to require. Years later, when he was handed that position anyway, his critics would point to this gap as proof that he was not truly qualified. It became one of the most debated questions about his legitimacy, a question that has never fully gone away.
Staying in Iran while his teacher went into exile was not the same as stepping back from the fight. If anything, Khamenei became more dangerous to the Shah's government precisely because he stayed. He was not a voice broadcasting from a safe distance in Iraq or France. He was right there, inside the country, moving through cities and towns, speaking in mosques, organizing quietly, and refusing to be silent. In 1967, he took on a project that immediately put him in the crosshairs of the Shah's secret police. He translated a book written by an Egyptian thinker named Sayyid Qutb into Farsi, the language spoken in Iran, so that ordinary Iranians could read it. Qutb's ideas were considered deeply dangerous by governments across the region. He argued that Muslim societies had been corrupted by foreign influence and that a return to strict religious rule was the only way forward. His writings would later inspire groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and, further down the line, organizations like Al-Qaeda. The Shah's secret police, Savak, moved quickly to block the book from being distributed, but Khamenei had already written the introduction, and in it he had stated plainly that the future belongs to Islam. It was not a subtle message. Savak took notice. Over the following years, Khamenei was arrested multiple times. Each time he was released, he went back to doing exactly what he had been doing before. He traveled around Iran, gave speeches, led prayers, and kept the network of opposition alive from the inside. He was not building an army, he was building something harder to destroy, a community of people who shared the same beliefs and trusted each other. The worst came in 1975. Khamenei was arrested in January of that year and held until August, 7 months in total, most of it in solitary confinement. His family was not told where he was. They did not know if he was alive. For 7 months, he sat alone in a cell with no contact from the outside world. Most people would come out of that experience broken, or at least deeply changed in a way that made them more careful, more quiet, more afraid. Khamenei came out and kept going. By 1977, the political situation in Iran was getting worse by the month. Protests were spreading. The Shah's government was losing its grip. Khamenei helped co-found an organization called the Association of Combatant Clergy, a group of religious figures who were openly committed to opposing the regime. It was one of the clearest signs yet that the clergy was no longer willing to stay out of politics. What makes Khamenei slightly harder to place than the simple image of a firebrand revolutionary is something most people do not expect. During these same years, he was reading Western novels. Books by American writers, including John Steinbeck, sat on his shelves. He was not reading them out of admiration for the West. He was reading them to understand how Westerners thought, what they valued, what moved them. He believed that to fight an enemy effectively, you first had to understand them from the inside. It was a habit of mind that set him apart from many of his fellow clerics, and it pointed toward the kind of leader he would eventually become: patient, calculating, and always thinking several steps ahead. The years of arrests, isolation, and silence had not broken Khamenei. They had hardened him. So when the moment that he and Khomeini had worked toward for so long finally arrived, he was ready. Through 1978, protests across Iran had grown from scattered demonstrations into something the Shah could no longer control. A fire at a cinema in the city of Abadan killed over 400 people, and though the evidence pointed toward Islamic extremists as the ones responsible, the public blamed the government. Trust in the Shah had collapsed completely. The streets filled with crowds demanding his removal. His health was failing, his government was crumbling, and the army that was supposed to protect him was losing the will to fight its own people. On January 16, 1979, the Shah boarded a plane and left Iran. He told the public he was going on a vacation. He never came back. 2 weeks later, on February 1st, Ayatollah Khomeini landed in Mashhad airport in Tehran. Millions of people lined the streets to welcome him. It was one of the largest crowds in human history gathered in one place for one moment. For the people who had spent years opposing the Shah, who had been beaten, imprisoned, and silenced, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. Within 10 days, what remained of the old government collapsed. February 11th is still celebrated today as the official end of the revolution. It was around this time that a detail about Khamenei emerged that surprised many people. It was revealed in 1980 that he had been a member of a secret 13-person body called the Islamic Revolutionary Council. This council had been quietly working behind the scenes during the final months of the Shah's rule, preparing for the transition to a new government. While most people thought of Khamenei as a mid-level cleric from Mashhad, he had in fact been sitting at the center of the revolution's inner circle the whole time. He had simply been doing it without anyone noticing. The revolution had succeeded in removing the Shah, but what came next was far more complicated than most people expected. The opposition to the Shah had never been a single united group. It included deeply religious clerics who wanted an Islamic state, secular politicians who wanted a Western-style democracy, left-wing groups with ties to the Soviet Union, and everything in between.
Through 1979, these groups fought bitterly over what kind of country Iran would become. It was not a physical war, not yet, but it was a fierce and sometimes deadly struggle for control. Khomeini and the clerics won. By December 1979, Iran was officially declared an Islamic republic, with Khomeini installed as its first supreme leader, the highest authority in the land, above the president, above the parliament, above everyone. Khamenei threw himself into building the new state. He helped establish the Islamic Republican Party, the official political party that would dominate Iranian politics for nearly a decade. He was also given a direct role in purging the military, removing officers who had served under the Shah and replacing them with people loyal to the new order. It was quiet, careful work, the kind of work that does not make headlines but shapes everything that comes after. Khamenei had spent years learning how power worked from the outside. Now he was learning how to build it from the inside.
In the new government, Khamenei rose quickly. He became a member of parliament, took on the role of leading Friday prayers in Tehran, and was seen increasingly as one of the key figures of the new Islamic Republic. He was visible, he was trusted by Khomeini, and he was moving closer to the center of power with every passing month. That visibility made him a target. On June 27, 1981, Khamenei arrived at the Abu Zar Mosque in Tehran to speak with members of the congregation. It was a routine appearance for someone in his position. A man approached him, dressed to look like a journalist, carrying a tape recorder. He placed the device on the surface in front of Khamenei as if preparing to record the speech. Then he stepped away. About a minute later, a strange whistling sound came from the recorder. Then it exploded. The blast tore through the room. Khamenei was rushed to hospital. He survived, but the damage was permanent. The nerves in his right arm were so badly injured that the arm has remained nearly paralyzed ever since. His neck was also hit, and his vocal cords were damaged in a way that never fully healed. This is why, decades later, when you watch Khamenei speak at Friday prayers or address the nation on television, his voice is always soft and slightly strained. That quiet, careful way of speaking is not a choice. It is the lasting mark left by a bomb that was meant to kill him. Inside the wreckage of the device, a message was found. It read, "A gift from the Furqan Group." The Furqan Group was a militant organization that opposed not just the Shah, but the entire system of clerical rule that had replaced him. They believed that concentrating so much power in the hands of religious leaders like Khomeini and Khamenei was a betrayal of what the revolution had promised. They had already assassinated several other senior figures before turning their attention to Khamenei. Now here is where the story becomes almost too strange to believe. 6 days before the bomb went off, Iran's first president since the revolution, a man named Abul Hassan Banisadr, had been removed from office. Khomeini pushed him out because Banisadr was seen as too secular, too willing to keep religion out of government decisions. His replacement, Mohammad Ali Rajai, took office as the second president of Iran. 29 days later, Rajai was assassinated in a bombing that killed him and the prime minister at the same time. In the space of weeks, Iran had lost 2 presidents. The country needed a third, and it needed one fast. Elections were called for October 2, 1981. Khamenei was still recovering from his injuries. His arm was broken, his voice was damaged, his body had been through serious trauma. He ran anyway. He won in a landslide, becoming the 3rd president of Iran since the revolution. 4 years later, in 1985, he ran again. This time, he took 87% of the vote. The man who had nearly been killed by a bomb in a mosque was now the elected leader of one of the most important countries in the Middle East. But even that, as it turned out, was not the top of the ladder. Being president of Iran in 1981 was not a comfortable job. It was not a position where you sat in a nice office, signed documents, and gave speeches at formal dinners.
It meant leading a country that was already at war, already under pressure from multiple directions, and already showing cracks in the revolutionary unity that had seemed so powerful just 2 years earlier. The war with Iraq had started in September 1980, more than a year before Khamenei became president. Saddam Hussein, the ruler of Iraq, had made a calculation that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. He looked at Iran and saw a country in chaos, its military weakened by purges, its government still finding its feet after the revolution, its relationship with the rest of the world in ruins. He decided it was the perfect moment to strike. He wanted to seize territory along the border, weaken the new Islamic government, and establish Iraq as the dominant power in the region. He expected a quick victory, a matter of weeks at most. What he got instead was nearly 8 years of one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century. Iran pushed back hard. The initial Iraqi advance was stopped and eventually reversed, with much of the fighting shifting onto Iraqi soil by 1981. But the war did not end. It ground on, year after bloody year, consuming lives at a rate that is difficult to fully absorb. Estimates put the total death toll at over 1 million people across both sides. Saddam Hussein, facing the reality that Iran was larger, more populated, and more determined than he had expected, asked for a ceasefire as early as 1982. Iran refused. The leadership in Tehran, with Khamenei's backing, decided to keep fighting, hoping to push all the way to victory. Here is where Khamenei's role becomes interesting. According to accounts from people inside the Iranian government at the time, Khamenei was among those who believed Iran should accept the ceasefire offer in 1982 and end the war. He saw the practical reality clearly. The war was costing Iran enormously in lives, money, and resources, and a negotiated peace was better than a prolonged conflict with no guaranteed end. But he was overruled. The decision was made to keep fighting, and Khamenei fell in line. He visited the front lines multiple times as president, showing solidarity with the soldiers. He played the role expected of him, even when his private view was different. This is one of the rare moments in his story where Khamenei appears less as a hardliner and more as a pragmatist, someone who could read a situation clearly and preferred a calculated outcome over an emotionally driven one. It is a quality that would define his leadership style for decades to come. Back home, the picture was darker. While the war raged at the border, the government was tightening its grip on Iranian society. Opposition groups were being hunted down. Courts were handing out harsh sentences to anyone seen as a threat to the Islamic Republic. The same revolutionary energy that had brought down the Shah was now being used to silence anyone who questioned the new order. Khamenei oversaw this process as president. He was not a passive observer. He was part of a system that punished dissent swiftly and without much mercy. The war finally ended in August 1988, when Iran accepted a ceasefire under enormous pressure. Khamenei described accepting it as drinking poison. The country was exhausted, grief-stricken, and economically drained, but the Islamic Republic had survived. Khamenei had served 2 full terms as president. What neither he nor anyone else fully understood yet was that the most consequential chapter of his life was still ahead.
The war ended in August 1988. Iran was exhausted, the economy was battered, and the country was still trying to make sense of nearly a decade of bloodshed. Then, before Iran had any real chance to recover, came the news that everyone had been quietly dreading for years. Ayatollah Khamenei's health had been declining for some time. He had suffered a heart attack in 1986, and by 1989 it was clear to those around him that he did not have long. For the clerics and politicians who ran Iran, this created a problem with no easy solution. Khomeini was not just a leader. He was the foundation the entire Islamic Republic had been built on. His face was everywhere. His words were law. His authority was beyond question. Nobody else came close to carrying that kind of weight. On June 3, 1989, Khomeini died. He was somewhere in his late 80s, the exact age always a matter of some debate. The country went into mourning on a scale that was difficult to describe.
Millions of people flooded the streets of Tehran for his funeral, grief so overwhelming that the ceremony had to be stopped at one point because the crowd surged forward and nearly overwhelmed the coffin. But grief had to wait. Iran needed a new supreme leader, and it needed one quickly. A long period of uncertainty at the top would make the government look weak, and there were plenty of people inside and outside Iran who would have been happy to take advantage of that weakness. The body responsible for choosing the supreme leader was called the Assembly of Experts, a council of senior religious scholars. They met the day after Khamenei died to work through the question of succession. Several names had been discussed over the years as possible candidates. None of them, however, had anything close to the religious authority or public stature that Khamenei had possessed. There was no obvious choice, no one person who stood above the rest and commanded broad agreement. What followed was a process of elimination as much as a process of selection. One by one, the strongest candidates either lacked the political support or carried too much controversy, or were simply too divisive to unite the council behind them. Khomeini's name kept coming up, not because everyone was excited about him, but because fewer people objected to him than to anyone else. He was known, he was trusted to a reasonable degree, he had served loyally as president, and he had never made the kind of enemies that would make his appointment impossible. In the final vote, Khomeini was chosen as the second supreme leader of Iran by 60 votes to 14. He was 50 years old. Shortly after the vote, a story began to circulate that Khomeini himself, in his final days, had privately indicated that Khomeini was his preferred successor. It was never confirmed. No written record was produced. No reliable witness came forward to verify it. Whether the story was true, or whether it was quietly spread by people who wanted to give Khomeini's appointment more legitimacy, nobody has ever fully established. The legitimacy question mattered for another reason, too. The position of supreme leader was supposed to require the highest level of religious scholarship. Khomeini, as discussed earlier, had left his studies before completing that training. Technically, by the rules the Islamic Republic had set for itself, he was not fully qualified for the job he had just been given. The council got around this, partly by upgrading his religious title on paper, but the gap between what the rules required and what had actually happened was hard to ignore. His critics pointed to it immediately, and the argument has never gone away entirely. What had just occurred was, by any measure, one of the most consequential decisions in the modern history of the Middle East. A man who had survived a bombing, spent years in prison, and risen through the ranks largely by being steady and loyal rather than brilliant or visionary, had just been handed the most powerful position in a country of tens of millions of people. Nobody, including Khomeini himself, could have fully predicted what the next 4 decades would look like. From the moment Khamenei became supreme leader, the question on everyone's mind was simple. What kind of ruler would he be? In the early years, some people genuinely hoped he might be more flexible than Khomeini, more open to change, more willing to let Iranian society breathe a little. Those hopes did not last long. One of the first things Khamenei did was make sure he had a force that was completely loyal to him personally. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a military organization that had been set up by Khomeini in 1979 to protect the revolution from internal and external threats, already existed when Khamenei took power. But he expanded it significantly and, more importantly, made sure that every senior commander was someone he had personally approved. Over the years, he worked his way through the entire leadership structure of the organization, placing his own people at every level. By the time the Guard Corps reached its current size of around 125,000 members, it was less a national institution and more a private army answering directly to one man. Roughly 1 out of every 700 Iranians was a member. It became the backbone of his grip on power. For most of the 1990s, Khamenei ruled with a firm hand, but without triggering any major public explosion. Then, in 1997, something unexpected happened. A cleric named Mohammad Khatami ran for president on a platform of reform. He talked about freedom of expression, civil rights, reducing the power of the security services, and opening Iran up to the world. He won by a landslide. Khamenei allowed it. Perhaps he calculated that a moderate president would release some of the public pressure that had been building up. Perhaps he simply underestimated how seriously Khatami would take his own promises. Either way, the reform era began. For a few years, Iran genuinely felt different. Newspapers multiplied. Debate opened up. Young people felt like the country might actually be moving in a new direction. Then the ceiling arrived. In 1999, a daily newspaper called Salam was shut down by the authorities after it published a report exposing internal government workings. Students in Tehran took to the streets in protest. The demonstrations grew over several days, turned into clashes with police, and left more than a dozen people dead and over 1,000 arrested. It was the largest public uprising since the revolution itself. Khamenei's response was to crush it. By 2004, the reform era was over. Khamenei and the Guardian Council, the unelected body that screens candidates for election, moved to block most reformist politicians from running for office. Khatami himself was barred from seeking a third term. The window that had briefly opened was shut, locked, and the key put away. The 2009 presidential election made everything worse. The incumbent president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was declared the winner with 63% of the vote over his reformist rival Mir Hussein Mousavi. Millions of Iranians refused to believe the result. The streets of Tehran filled with protesters wearing green, the color that had become the symbol of the opposition movement. It was the biggest challenge to the Islamic Republic since its founding. Khamenei's response followed a pattern that had become familiar. Mass arrests, universities temporarily closed, internet access heavily restricted, and public gatherings banned. The Green Movement was broken. In 2005, Khamenei had established a unit within the police force called the Guidance Patrol, known more commonly as the Morality Police. Its job was to enforce religious rules in public, particularly around how women dressed. It reported directly to Khamenei, bypassing the civilian government entirely. For years, it operated in the background, a source of fear and resentment for millions of Iranians, especially young women. Then, in 2022, a young woman named Mahsa Amini was detained by the morality police for an alleged violation of the headscarf law. She died in custody. The anger that followed spread across Iran and then across the world, putting a spotlight on a system of control that Khamenei had been quietly building for decades. Behind all of this sat Evin Prison, a facility on the outskirts of Tehran that had become a symbol of what happened to people who pushed too hard against the regime. Journalists, lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens who had said the wrong thing in the wrong place had passed through its gates. Reports of torture and abuse inside its walls had been coming out for years. It was the sharp edge of a system designed not just to punish opposition, but to make sure that the thought of opposition felt too costly to act on. The true test of any authoritarian government is not what happens during quiet times. It is what happens when the people around it start to fall. When neighboring countries crack open, when ordinary citizens look at the streets of a city far away and think, maybe we could do that too. In late 2010, a young street vendor in Tunisia set himself on fire in protest against a government that had humiliated him once too often. That single act of desperation lit a fire that spread across the Arab world with a speed that no one had predicted. Within months, the president of Tunisia had fled the country. Egypt's long-ruling leader, Hosni Mubarak, was pushed out after 18 days of massive protests in Cairo's central square. Libya descended into armed conflict. Syria broke into a civil war that would last for years and kill hundreds of thousands of people. The wave of uprisings became known as the Arab Spring, and for a brief moment it seemed like it might reshape the entire region. Iran watched all of this very closely. Khamenei's public response was almost darkly ironic. He described the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia as an Islamic awakening, suggesting that Muslim populations were finally rising up against corrupt, Western-backed rulers. He framed it as a validation of everything the Iranian Revolution had stood for in 1979. Then the same wave reached Iran's own shores, and his tone changed completely.
On February 14, 2011, tens of thousands of protesters gathered in the streets of Tehran and other Iranian cities. The date was chosen deliberately. It was the anniversary of the day, 32 years earlier, when the revolution had triumphantly established the Islamic Republic. The protesters were not calling for a foreign-backed overthrow. They were Iranians, many of them the same young people who had been part of the Green Movement 2 years before, asking for the same things they had been asking for all along: more freedom, fairer elections, less repression. Khamenei's response came fast and hard. The Revolutionary Guard Corps was deployed into the streets. Security forces moved to break up gatherings before they could grow. But what made this moment particularly striking was a detail that did not receive much attention in international news coverage at the time. Units connected to Hezbollah, the Lebanese armed group that Iran had been funding and supporting for decades, were reportedly brought in to help suppress the protests on Iranian soil. Iran had spent years building Hezbollah as a tool to use against enemies abroad, primarily Israel. Now that same tool was being turned inward, used to keep Iranians themselves from organizing effectively. The protests continued in smaller bursts through February and into March. There was an attempt to revive the movement on its one-year anniversary in February 2012. Each time the security forces were ready, and each time the movement was contained before it could find its footing. The result was that Iran became one of the very few countries in the Middle East where the Arab Spring produced almost no lasting change. Governments fell in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. Syria burned, but the Islamic Republic stood. Khamenei saw the wave coming, prepared for it, and crushed it before it could become something he could not control. It was, in purely practical terms, one of the most effective acts of political survival of his entire time in power. Whether it was something to admire or something to be horrified by depended entirely on which side of the prison gates you were standing on.
Khamenei had proven he could hold on to power. He had outlasted protests, crushed reform movements, and survived a wave of uprisings that toppled governments across the region. But running a country is not only about staying in power. It is also about making life better for the people living in it. On that measure, the story becomes much harder to defend. In the early years after Khamenei took over, the economic picture was not entirely bleak. Iran was coming out of a devastating 8-year war with Iraq, and there was a natural rebound as the country began to rebuild. Infrastructure that had been destroyed needed replacing. Factories that had been idle started running again. People who had been focused entirely on survival during the war years began spending and building once more. Through the 1990s, the economy grew at a reasonable pace. The 2000s brought another boost, this time from an outside source. China was in the middle of one of the greatest economic expansions in history, and it needed enormous amounts of oil to fuel that growth. Iran had oil in abundance, and China was willing to buy it, even as Western countries were tightening their restrictions on Iranian trade. For several years, Iran's economy grew at around 7 or 8% annually, a rate that most countries would be very happy with. On paper, Iran looked like a rising power. Its total economic output placed it inside the top 30 economies in the world, sitting alongside countries far larger and more developed. But that headline number hid a much less flattering reality. When you divide a country's total wealth by the number of people living there, you get a very different picture of how ordinary citizens are actually doing. On that measure, Iran fell outside the top 100 countries in the world. Its standard of living was comparable to Algeria, Indonesia, or Bolivia. Countries with no oil at all, no vast reserves of natural gas sitting under their soil, were doing just as well or better than Iran when it came to the daily lives of their citizens. From around 2010 onwards, even the headline numbers stopped looking good. Economic growth slowed sharply and then stalled. Official unemployment figures hovered around 10%, but economists who studied Iran closely believed the real number was significantly higher, particularly among young people. A country that had a large, educated young population was failing to create enough jobs to absorb them. The reason sitting at the center of all of this was sanctions. Since 1979, Western countries, led by the United States, had placed economic restrictions on Iran in response to various actions by its government. These restrictions made it very difficult for Iran to sell its oil freely on international markets, to access the global banking system, or to attract foreign investment. Every time tensions rose over Iran's nuclear program or its support for armed groups in the region, the sanctions tightened further. The painful irony was almost impossible to overstate. Iran sat on some of the largest oil and gas reserves on the planet. It had the natural resources to be one of the wealthiest countries in its region. Instead, its people stood in long lines to buy subsidized bread. Young graduates struggled to find work, and the national currency lost value year after year. The wealth was there, buried under the ground. The politics kept it from reaching the people who needed it most. That gap between what Iran could have been and what it actually was became one of the deepest sources of frustration for ordinary Iranians living under Khamenei's rule.
While Khamenei was tightening his grip inside Iran, he was playing a very different kind of game beyond its borders. Inside the country, his approach was direct: use force, control information, remove anyone who threatens the system. Outside the country, he was far more patient. He built slowly, funded quietly, and let other people do the fighting while Iran pulled the strings from a distance. The centerpiece of this strategy was Hezbollah. This organization was born in Lebanon in 1982 during a period of civil war that had been tearing the country apart for years. When Israel invaded Lebanon that same year, a group of Shia Muslim clerics in the south of the country began organizing a resistance movement. Iran saw an opportunity immediately. It provided funding, weapons, and training from the very beginning. Over the following decades, Hezbollah grew from a small militia into the most powerful non-government armed force in the entire Middle East. It had its own military wing, its own television channel, its own social services network, and enough missiles to threaten the whole of northern Israel. It also entered Lebanese politics and became one of the dominant forces in the country's parliament. Iran had essentially helped build a state within a state, one that answered to Tehran as much as it answered to Beirut. Hamas presented a more complicated relationship. Hamas is a Sunni Muslim organization, which puts it in a different branch of Islam from Iran's Shia establishment. In religious terms, the two should have little in common, but Khamenei was never purely a religious thinker when it came to foreign policy. He was a strategist. Hamas controlled the Gaza Strip and was committed to the destruction of Israel. That shared goal was enough. Iran began funding and arming Hamas, and the relationship held despite the sectarian differences that divided them on paper. Qatar also supported Hamas, which made the funding network more complex, but Iran's role remained significant. The result was that Israel found itself facing Iranian-backed pressure from two directions: the north through Hezbollah in Lebanon and the southwest through Hamas in Gaza. Further away, in Yemen, Khamenei had been quietly supporting a group called the Houthis since at least 2009. Yemen was a poor, divided country at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, and the Houthis were a Shia movement that had been fighting against the central government for years. When a full civil war broke out in 2014, Iran was already deeply embedded in the Houthi network, supplying weapons and strategic support. The war in Yemen became a proxy conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with the two regional powers backing opposite sides. The Houthis eventually took control of the capital and large parts of the country, giving Iran influence over a stretch of coastline that looked directly onto one of the world's most important shipping routes, the Red Sea. Beyond the Middle East, Khamenei built relationships with larger powers that could offer Iran some protection from Western pressure. Russia and China both had reasons to oppose American dominance in global affairs, and both were willing to do business with Iran when Western companies were not. The relationship with Russia deepened significantly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, when Iran began supplying Russia with large numbers of military drones for use in the war. It was a transaction that drew sharp criticism from Western governments, but demonstrated how far the Iran-Russia partnership had developed. Closer to home, Iran maintained workable relationships with Qatar, which shared control of a massive natural gas field with Iran, and with Oman, which had historically played a quiet diplomatic role between Iran and the West. Iraq, once Iran's bitter enemy, had become something closer to a partner after American forces withdrew and the country's Shia majority gained political power. The map of Iranian influence across the region, built piece by piece over 3 decades, looked impressive. What nobody fully understood yet was how quickly it could unravel.
Behind all the proxy networks, behind all the regional alliances, there was one issue that had defined Iran's relationship with the rest of the world more than anything else. It had been the main reason for decades of economic punishment. It had shaped every major diplomatic conversation involving Iran since the 1990s. It was the nuclear program. And the story behind it was far stranger than most people realized. The program did not begin with the Islamic Republic. It did not begin with Khamenei or even with Khomeini. It began in 1957 under the Shah with direct help from the United States. At the time, America and Iran were close allies, and the United States was actively encouraging friendly countries to develop nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. In 1967, the American government, under President Lyndon Johnson, provided Iran with several kilograms of enriched uranium for a research reactor being built in Tehran. The Shah had ambitious plans to build more than a dozen nuclear power plants across the country. None of this was secret. It was considered normal cooperation between allied nations. Then came the revolution of 1979, and Iran's new government inherited the program. The relationship with America collapsed overnight, and the Western suppliers who had been helping Iran with its nuclear development pulled out. Progress slowed through the 1980s, partly because of the war with Iraq, and partly because Iran had lost access to the markets and technology it had previously relied on. But the program never stopped. By the 1990s, with Khamenei firmly in charge, the pace picked up again. China provided Iran with a fusion reactor in 1993. Russia stepped in with technical experts and helped develop key facilities. Underground sites were constructed at places like Fordo, buried deep enough to survive conventional airstrikes. Facilities at Natanz and Isfahan became central to the enrichment of uranium, the process of refining the material to the point where it could potentially be used in a weapon. Iran's official position never changed. The government consistently maintained that the entire program was for civilian purposes only, to generate electricity and advance scientific research. On the surface, this argument had some logic. Many countries around the world operated nuclear power plants, and there was nothing automatically suspicious about wanting to join them. The problem was the context. Iran was a country sitting on some of the largest oil and gas reserves on Earth. It had more than enough energy resources to power itself many times over without needing a single nuclear reactor. The economic cost of the sanctions that the nuclear program attracted ran into hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades. No rational government would accept that kind of damage to its economy just to build power plants it did not need. The conclusion that most outside observers drew was obvious, even if Iran would never confirm it publicly. The goal was a nuclear weapon, or at minimum, the capability to build one quickly if the situation required it. In 2015, a rare moment of diplomatic progress occurred. Iran agreed to a deal with the United States and several other major powers, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under the agreement, Iran accepted strict limits on its nuclear activities and allowed international inspectors to monitor its facilities. In return, the crippling sanctions that had been squeezing its economy for years were significantly loosened. It was not a perfect deal, and critics on both sides found reasons to complain about it, but it represented the closest thing to a workable compromise that anyone had managed to produce. 3 years later, it fell apart. In 2018, the newly elected American president, Donald Trump, announced that the United States was withdrawing from the agreement unilaterally. He argued the deal had not gone far enough in restricting Iran. The sanctions snapped back almost immediately, harder than before. Iran responded by gradually stepping up its nuclear activities again, enriching uranium to higher levels and reducing cooperation with international inspectors. The window that had briefly opened closed again, and the two sides returned to a state of open hostility that would eventually lead somewhere far more dangerous than anyone had publicly acknowledged.
For decades, Khamenei's strategy of building influence through proxy groups had looked like a success. Hezbollah controlled southern Lebanon, Hamas controlled Gaza, the Houthis controlled large parts of Yemen. Iran had created a ring of armed allies stretching across the Middle East, each one pointed like an arrow at Israel and at American interests in the region. From Tehran, it must have looked like a masterpiece of patient, long-term planning. Then came October 7, 2023, and everything began to unravel. On that morning, Hamas launched the largest attack on Israel in decades. Fighters crossed the border from Gaza, killing around 1,200 people, many of them civilians at a music festival and in small communities near the border. They also took 251 people hostage and brought them back into Gaza. The scale of the attack shocked the world. Israel's response was immediate and overwhelming. Its military launched a massive campaign into the Gaza Strip, destroying large portions of the territory in an effort to dismantle Hamas entirely. As the fighting in Gaza continued, Hezbollah began firing rockets into northern Israel from Lebanon, opening a second front. The Houthis in Yemen started attacking commercial ships passing through the Red Sea, disrupting global trade routes and drawing the attention of the United States Navy. What had begun as a single attack in Gaza had spread into a multi-front conflict, pulling in players from across the region. Israel then did something that demonstrated just how deeply it had penetrated Iran's network. In September 2024, thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah members across Lebanon suddenly exploded almost simultaneously. Israel had somehow managed to intercept the devices during the supply chain process and plant small explosive charges inside them. Dozens of Hezbollah fighters were killed and thousands were wounded in a single day. It was one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in modern history, and it sent a message that Iran's most powerful proxy had been compromised at a level no one had imagined possible. Israeli airstrikes followed, targeting Hezbollah's military infrastructure and leadership in Lebanon. Several of Hezbollah's most senior commanders were killed. The organization, which had spent 40 years growing into a fearsome force, was severely damaged within a matter of months. Between April and October 2024, Iran and Israel exchanged direct missile strikes for the first time in history. Both sides fired at each other's territory, crossing a line that had previously existed only as a threat. The situation was escalating in ways that had no clear endpoint. Then, on June 13, 2025, Israel launched what amounted to a full strike on Iran itself. In a series of coordinated attacks, Israeli forces hit nuclear facilities, military bases, and key infrastructure across the country. Many of Iran's most senior military commanders were killed in precision strikes. Nuclear scientists who had spent years working on the program that Khamenei had protected so carefully were also among the dead. Khamenei went into hiding. According to reports that emerged at the time, he began making arrangements for the question of succession, preparing for the possibility that he might be assassinated before the situation stabilized. The man who had ruled Iran for nearly 4 decades was now hiding from airstrikes in his own country. The United States joined the campaign shortly after, conducting its own strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. The program that Iran had spent billions of dollars and decades of sanctions quietly building was being dismantled from the air. The conclusion that observers around the world drew was painful but difficult to argue with. Iran had spent 35 years constructing a military and political network designed to make it untouchable. It had proxies in 4 countries, ballistic missiles, a near-nuclear capability, and alliances with Russia and China. On paper, it looked powerful. In practice, when Israel and the United States decided to act directly, Iran had almost nothing effective with which to respond. Its air defenses proved inadequate, its proxies were in ruins, its nuclear sites were burning. The phrase that began appearing in news reports and analysis pieces was blunt: paper tiger. A country that looked strong for a very long time had been revealed at the moment it mattered most to be far weaker than anyone, including perhaps Khamenei himself, had been willing to admit.
So, after everything we have been through in this story, how do we make sense of Ali Khamenei? He is, by any measure, one of the longest-serving leaders anywhere in the world. He took power in 1989, when the Cold War was still running, when the Soviet Union still existed, when most of the leaders currently running major countries were still in school. He has outlasted 9 American presidents. He has watched governments rise and fall across the Middle East, while his own stayed standing. That kind of political survival is not an accident. It takes a particular kind of intelligence, a particular kind of ruthlessness, and a very clear understanding of where power comes from and how to hold on to it. But it is also worth remembering how he got there in the first place. Khamenei did not rise to the top because he was the most qualified, the most respected, or the most visionary person in the room. He rose because a bomb went off and left him with a damaged arm and a broken voice. He rose because the president before him was thrown out for being too moderate, and the president after that was blown up after less than a month in office. He rose because when Khamenei died, the council tasked with choosing a successor could not agree on anyone better, and Khamenei was the option that the fewest people objected to. History handed him his position as much as he earned it. Once he had it, he spent the next 35 years building a state around one central idea, that Iran's purpose was to resist the West, to oppose Israel, and to spread the influence of the Islamic Revolution across the region. Everything else, the economy, the rights of ordinary citizens, the hopes of young Iranians who wanted a different kind of future, was secondary to that mission. The proxy network in Lebanon, Gaza, and Yemen was the physical expression of that idea. The nuclear program was its ultimate insurance policy. The events of 2024 and 2025 did not just damage those projects, they exposed the gap between the image Khamenei had carefully constructed over decades and the reality underneath it. The image was of a defiant, powerful Iran that could not be broken. The reality, revealed when Israel and the United States finally decided to act directly, was a country whose air defenses failed, whose proxies collapsed, and whose supreme leader went into hiding while foreign missiles destroyed facilities he had spent a generation protecting. For ordinary Iranians, that exposure carried a particular bitterness. They had lived under economic sanctions for decades, watching the value of their currency shrink, watching opportunities disappear, watching friends and relatives leave the country in search of a better life elsewhere. They had been told that the suffering was necessary, that it was the price of resistance, that the cause was worth it. The events of 2025 made it very hard to argue that the price had been worth anything at all. Khamenei is now in his mid-80s. The question of what comes after him has been discussed quietly in Iran for years, and now, with the country's military infrastructure in ruins and its regional network dismantled, that question feels more urgent than ever. Will the next supreme leader be another hardline cleric, someone who sees Khamenei's path as the right one and simply wants to continue it? Will the system find a way to reform itself from within, producing a leadership that is more willing to compromise, to open up, to let Iranians breathe? Or will the pressure that has been building for decades finally reach a breaking point? And will the young people who took to the streets for Mahsa Amini, who risked everything to say that enough was enough, finally find a way to reshape their own country? That is the question Iran is living with right now. A man who survived a bomb, spent years in prison, ruled for nearly 40 decades, and built an empire of influence across the Middle East is nearing the end of his time. What he leaves behind is a country with enormous potential, a proud and ancient civilization, a young and educated population sitting on vast natural wealth that has been held back for most of its modern life by the choices of the people running it. Where Iran goes next is one of the most important questions in the world today. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If this story gave you something to think about, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one.